I have a question. Where do you think the trials will be for the 2022 Commonwealths? Will it be a sort of independent of anything else trial, or how will that work, do you think?
So I don't think we've got trials for the England Commonwealth team in any of the events. But I do know there will be some track opportunities, we need to read into the nitty-gritty of the selection policy, as to what level of competition would be appropriate for chasing down a qualifying time. Actually we're in discussion with some competition organisers to put on 10,000 metre race walk events. So we'll certainly have competition opportunities, and I think we should be fairly confident that later on this year and into the autumn that we'll have we'll be back racing and can start to chase down some of the times. I reckon I can see 2 questions on.
See the questions now, Andy?
Yeah, go on then.
Do you want me to read them out? That might help. So, question from Jacqueline. 10K, how far should your training load be a week ideally?
Cool. That's a good question, Jacqueline. Nice one. Well, I think it depends where you're at the moment. I think that's the big challenge, actually. So the answer is it depends. I think, in essence, if we want to improve, we need to go quicker. We need, obviously, underpinning that, we need good technique. And then in terms of like the training sessions that we're doing, then we want to push on for most of the sort of developing group that we're talking about this evening. We probably all want to push on speed and stamina. So we're doing intervals and we're doing some tempo, and then we're dropping in some other endurance type training sessions alongside that. So then it's just working out how much to increase. So if you do 50k a week at the moment, then it also depends on the intensity of that and what else you've got going on. But if we added sort of 10%, if we sort of up that to 55k, sat at that for a little while, and added similar sort of 10% increments periodically, then we're probably sort of going to cope with that without sort of coming unstuck, getting ill and injured.
Question from Carl. In the absence of scientific testing to determine VO2 max and LTP, the only method is heart rate. Problem is the reliability of heart rate watch reporting. So can you relate heart rate and pace as an indicator from field testing times? It's a tough one.
That's a good question. Hello, Carl. And I know Carl, and so great that you're on. You've joined us this evening. That is a challenge working with, if you've done a sort of a treadmill lab type test, you've probably identified some fairly precise sort of zones that heart rate fits into. If we don't have that, then we are guesstimating, a little bit. So, but one thing we do know from the research that we did, and it is a few years ago now, but we're going to repeat some of it in Leeds in coming year or so once we get out of lockdown, and I'll be fairly confident that we'll sort of back it up with very similar, was that the 10k race pace in a race walker was spot on the lactate turn point, and that's a really kind of key sort of training variable for us to identify. So in short, if you're sort of doing 10k pace training, that's probably sort of tempo, stamina type intensity. If you want to know sort of speed at max VO2, some other work that we did, we found that a 2,000 meter time trial, so 5 laps of the track flat out, equated to the speed at max VO2 in athletes. So, and more recently, we've been getting into, it's not a new test, it's pretty old, but we've got into using critical speed tests, again, as a measure of that similar sort of variable, that the lactate turn point, anaerobic threshold type sort of zone to build training around. So yeah, we've sort of published some of that previously. So by all means, people ping me a line and I can share that with you. We've looked at bits of it in some of the other webinars as well. We've made good use of it elsewhere as well. So yeah, hopefully that would address that.
Got quite a few questions now, Andy.
Cool.
If you can't see the questions, if you click the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to see them on the screen as well. A question from Steve. Can you suggest whether the staple type of 5 times 4 minute session is suitable choice for a group session with ages from under 17 upwards, or is there a better option that totals 20 minutes worth of effort?
Cool, good question. Right, the other session that we described, I guess you could, if you're not using the track, you're perhaps on using a road circuit. The other training session that we described in that training study, the 2 times 20 minutes, we often sort of organize that type of training as a group, in a group session, as like an out and back. So you do 10 minutes out, turn, and come back in 10 minutes. And as a group, everybody has then done the same 20 minutes of work. And it should all finish more or less at the same time, dependent on a little bit of pace judgment. So yeah, you can probably work that in for the, if you were doing 4 minutes, so out for 2, back for 2. I guess that could, that might be one way of doing that with a group, because you're then, you're involving everybody. If you get dropped at the start, well, then you've got to hold everybody off on the way back. If you get the furthest out in the 2 minutes, then obviously you've got a load of rabbits to chase back. So it does involve, it kind of involves the group in doing that. So that might be one way of sort of addressing that.
And there's one here on the chat. Would you expect to reach a plateau after 6 weeks and need to change, or would you see continued improvement over time, looking at the 6-week study that you presented earlier?
Sure. So I think 6 weeks is often sort of described as sort of a typical sort of time frame for that we might sort of plateau in level of performance. So we might need to change the stimulus. But I guess as we were collecting some training data, just split times from the athletes in those training sessions, we would perhaps expect to see them, to go up and then sort of start to flatline. And then, I guess we look then as, what are our goals? Are we trying to get them faster? Or if we're happy that we're fast enough, do we look for a sort of a different element in the training? So, do we focus perhaps more on the sort of the tempo type training sessions, or sort of look at other places in the week where we can add some load? But I think in most cases with the developing athletes, we don't often get to a stage with an athlete's career where we sort of say that they're fast enough. We might reach that point if they're like a senior athlete, who's comfortably qualified for things like the Olympic Games, and then we might sort of work on other elements. But I think in most cases we'd be pushing on pace in intervals, particularly with the sort of group we've talked about this evening. So we might just revisit and reset the target, the paces, the lap times.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions left, and it's 5-2, so hopefully we can get through these. One from Jonathan, no pressure, talking about the Astrandatal research that you're perhaps trying to do shorter intervals to keep lactate down and fit in more work. Is there an argument that we might get more benefit from doing long intervals to force lactate up with less overall work? What should our objective be? Cool. That's a good question. If I think about where we're at with the senior performers, then as we're honing in on like a sort of real key sort of goal competition, then we're certainly doing long, intense intervals. It's things like 2,000 meter intervals, with short recovery. But we're looking for sort of stable lactates there.
So if we did those early in the season, we might find that we'd get the work done, but we would have very high lactates. And I guess in our event group, we're looking for the most work we can do by maintaining sort of a steady state lactate. So we tend to sort of do the same sort of work, a bit like the example with the Astran example. So we tend to be doing sort of shorter intervals, perhaps sort of similar volume as later in the year, but over doing sort of things like 500 meter intervals at sort of tempo intensity, and then working our way up to 2000s a little bit later on during the year. So I guess that what I'm always sort of coming back to is what's the sort of the what's the pace, what's the goal of the training session? Are we sort of building the speed that we want? But that's the other way of doing it. It's different. It's the sort of the polar opposite routes. Of going after the sort of the same goal of improving performance, and then that's down to perhaps individual athletes and their preferences, as well as as how they might sort of take on that sort of challenge.
And last question, for 10K, what would the ideal long steady race walk on a Sunday be?
Cool. So long session, I guess. Well, sessions that develop endurance. Anything that's sort of like 20 minutes up to well over an hour plus. Will develop endurance. If we're racing 10K, some of those examples that we looked at, some of the sort of the first season the athletes attempted the distance, they were doing times of perhaps it was an average as well. So I know some of them were well over an hour, so we would perhaps want to do doing an endurance session of an hour plus would sort of give us that confidence that we could complete the distance. But hour and a half getting up to is really good sort of endurance stimulus. But I guess it's from where you've started out at is is important. So if the longest you've done is 5 miles, 8 kilometers, if you launch into double that, 16 Ks, that's going to be sort of a really sort of tough training session. But if you're getting down to the sorts of times that would make that start to appear in those Commonwealth Games rankings, then you're probably doing sessions of 60 to 90 minutes, and that's pretty good preparation for 20K as well. So and the 20K athletes, some of them will do a bit longer than that, so 60 to 90 minutes might be a good starting point.